The Australian Financial Review.
Hello, I'm James Thompson, Senior Chanticleer columnist at the AFR. Welcome to our weekly news breakdown of all things business, finance and markets. With me today, as always, it's my Chanticleer colleague, the man who should go home and host his own economic reform roundtable. It's Anthony McDonald. How are you, Anthony?
I definitely listed 10 things I could work on, James.
I've got another 10 for you as well. Well, this week we look at what, if anything, was achieved at the Treasurer's big economic talk fest in Canberra this week. We bring you the most disappointing results of the profit season, and we look ahead to the biggest few days for markets. But first, Anthony, let's go to one of our big rolling stories, and that's Qantas illegally sacking more than 1,800 staff, including baggage handlers and other workers during the pandemic. Now, Qantas got its fine this week, $90 million or 3/4 of the maximum penalty available, to take the total cleanup bill of this exercise to $210 million. Anthony, that's a lot of money, but I reckon Qantas got off lightly here. Why was this a great escape?
James, I just can't say this is a good story for Qantas. Like, those words, they just won't come out of my mouth.
Fair enough.
It doesn't feel right. Yeah, to recap, Qantas illegally sacked those baggage handlers, aircraft cleaners and other ground staff while their jobs were grounded in 2020, mid-pandemic. It went to court, Qantas lost, went to the High Court, Qantas lost. This week it was back in front of the judge who they faced first time around, and it was time to determine the penalty. Now, Justice Lee, that's Michael Lee, he's getting a lot of the high-profile cases at the moment.
Sure is.
Yeah, he gave Qantas the $90 million fine. $50 million will go to the Transport Workers Union, who brought the case. The other 40 is expected to go to the 1,821 workers who lost their jobs. So, James, you said they got off lightly, and while I won't say it's a good news story, I think you're right. I mean, it's cost them about $210 million in cleanup costs, effectively. However, it's supposed to save Qantas $125 million a year.
Yep.
So it only takes about a year and a half worth of savings, and you've paid for the cleanup job, James. So from the numbers, it looks like it's good business. But I can't see this as a value creation exercise.
No.
Qantas blatantly put one stakeholder group in front of the others, right? Profits in front of customers and employees.
That's exactly right. And I don't think Qantas CEO Vanessa Hudson's dancing in the cockpit in any way, shape or form. The entire judgment's worth reading. Justice Lee, he digs both boots in and then borrows a few other boots and digs them in as well.
Yeah.
You know, he suggests that he's not sure Qantas is quite as contrite as they think. Maybe they said the wrong kind of sorry. The corporate culture might not have changed, particularly in the area of IR, where this sort of very adversarial us versus them approach is Lee thinks is still ingrained in the company. So I don't think it's not a good news story for Qantas. But I just come back, look at the share price. Did not move with this decision. Now, partly that is because everyone had priced this in. And in fact, most people in the market would have priced in $120 million fine or penalty because that was the maximum available, and most people reckon Qantas should have got their right whack. I agree with that. I think this penalty is actually inadequate. And I know Justice Lee agonised over the decision. He took into account some of the steps that Qantas has taken to mitigate the damage. But I think we've got a real issue here, because what you're saying is exactly right. The numbers still work. The math still works for Qantas. But what we've got is a penalty that doesn't really reflect that. The compensation bill doesn't really reflect that. And I think another point that Justice Lee made is really important. No government agency went after Qantas over this.
Yeah.
It's within the Fair Work Ombudsman's remit to do so. But it was left up to the union to chase this down and carry the cost of taking this case all the way through the courts. That doesn't sit right with me. Courts and regulators are supposed to provide the sticks in a capitalist society like we've got. You can see where the carrot is there. The carrot for Qantas is to maximise profits. But when the incentives get out of whack, then the sticks need to come into play. And I just don't know if the sticks have come into play in the right way here, Anthony. I agree with you. I'm not going to call this good news for Qantas. I don't think it's good news for any of us. I'm not sure the system's worked here for anyone.
Oh, definitely. And like, if you think, sustainable value creation is what companies should be trying to do for shareholders, that's balancing, the shareholders, the employees, the customers. Clearly, that balance wasn't there just here. And James, we've had a host of profit results from the commercial property sector this week, and it's fair to say that the big dogs of the industry are suddenly feeling pretty upbeat. Oof. In fact, one has declared we're about to enter a pressure cooker situation that will push property valuations up. What's going on here?
Well, three things, Anthony. First, interest rates are falling, which is good for property valuations. Second, investors are starting to come back to the property sector, particularly big institutional investors. So think pension funds and superannuation funds and sovereign wealth funds. They've seen equity markets climb in the last 2 years. Suddenly they're under allocated to property. They don't have as much property as they should. So they're coming back into the sector as rates fall. The third thing that's really important is we just haven't been building anything new in any property sector. There's no new shopping centres. There's very few new offices. There's very few new factories and warehouses. And we know there's not enough new houses. So what happens there? When you get renewed interest from investors and buyers and there's not enough stuff to buy, prices go up. And that's what we're seeing. David Harrison, the CEO of Charter Hall, reckons he can feel the FOMO from investors and buyers coming. Sellers don't want to sell and there's not enough new stuff to buy. So you get this pressure cooker where property valuations go up. Now, we do need to see this in context, Anthony. Like the commercial property sector's had a pretty tough few years as rates were rising. But the worm is starting to turn. And I spoke to Mirvac, Stockland, Lendlease, Charter Hall, Dexus, all of them saying the same things. Limited supply, the cycle has turned, things are going to get better for us. So, look, I mean, it's interesting how these shortages work, isn't it? That it's a reminder how cyclical some sectors are. You go through the bad period and it inevitably leads to the next good period and vice versa, I guess.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So this is a supply and demand story. And so it's good for people that own the properties, right, James? But what about for the rest of us? Like, this feels a little bit like the property sector pinching more of the economic pie rather than growing it, right?
Maybe. I think that's a reasonable issue. I think the good thing is all of these guys are reporting that construction costs and construction inflation is coming down too. So that means we should be able to get some new buildings out of the ground, which should be good for, the broader economy. It should help push the economy along a bit, and goodness knows we need it. So I do take your point that maybe this is just going to be the property sector feasting. But if we can get some new supply, actual new supply, then that should be good for the economy too, I reckon.
Yeah, I hope you're right, James. And we've been talking about the commercial property market, but it's exact same on the residential side, where we want to see this supply of housing come through.
Yeah. All right, Anthony, let's move to our first big topic. And we finally got there this week. The Treasurer's Economic Reform Roundtable actually happened. This is the big event that we've been hearing about since the government won in May, and the one that big and small business has peppered with ideas and submissions. Now, it all played out over 3 days in Canberra and culminated in an hour-long summary by Treasurer Jim Chalmers, and probably the longest to-do list ever presented in the nation's history. Anthony, the way Chalmers tells it, there was plenty of agreement within the room that a lot more needed to be done to improve productivity, to cut red tape, to speed up planning approvals, to simplify regulation, to modernise government services, to tackle AI, to boost investment, and reform the tax system.
Long list.
Anthony, it seems like Chalmers' overarching message, and the one he did finish on, was actually a good one, I reckon. And that was the commitment to fix the intergenerational inequality that is pervasive through Australian society. He said there was universal agreement within the roundtable room that it should be a top priority for the government. Does that make sense to you? And what did you make of this event more broadly?
It was a bit of a funny one, James. Like, we've spoken about it a lot in recent weeks. Heaps written about it in the paper, all over the front page for 2 months. Business really bought in, got really excited, heaps of submissions, all that sort of stuff in the lead up. But when we got there, from a media perspective, James, at least, it was a bit underwhelming. Like, I tuned into the PM's opening address on Tuesday.
Yep.
It was nice and early, 8 a.m. I thought it was pretty flat. Not sure what I was expecting, but it was just like a bloke sitting around a round table. There was no real banging on the table or call to arms. I thought it was flat. And then Chalmers said his bit. Then the curtain was drawn, the doors were shut.
Yeah.
And the media was basically locked out for the next 3 days. Now, when you're sitting in Sydney like me or Melbourne like you and you're following the coverage, it was pretty haphazard. Like the main stories in the paper, they didn't really feel like they should be the main stories. Like you'd hope there was much more significant stuff than whether the PM did or didn't have a go at Michelle Bullock. So it was weird. We didn't hear a lot from Chalmers himself, and he can be everywhere when he wants to. Like he some days he does more TV than Karl Stefanovic. I swear. But to his credit, he seemed to be saving it up for the end, and quite deliberately on Thursday night, he came out and he sort of explained what had been going on, explained what they talked through, explained the long to-do list, all the different people involved. I can see why that was probably a useful approach to do it. Rather than giving running commentary. And as we're in the media, it's great to actually hear what's going on inside the room, and transparency is always a good thing. But I can understand if this really is going to be a significant event, maybe let them thrash it out and then come and tell us afterwards. So it wasn't until Thursday night that we really got a good feel for the breadth and depth of the discussion and potentially what could come out of it. And for anyone that missed it, I'd recommend listening to his speech. Like we said, there's a list of 10 things, heaps to do. There was a lot to like about his speech, James. I love that politics only, from when I was listening, I think it only came up once.
Yeah.
He had to go at the Liberal Party and the debt they left, which we all know is a result of the COVID pandemic and what happened there. I mean, so it wasn't very political. It seemed honest and genuine, heartfelt. Probably the most important thing, it was hopeful and positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you just can't help but wonder whether that's the result of people being in a room and being on the same team and living in a bit of a bubble for a few days.
Exactly. And Anthony, as I've reflected on the list of 10 things, like it sounds quite substantive, but as you go through them, a lot of it was stuff they're already doing, sort of repackaged to make it sound like a bit of a sell job. I do take your point about politics, but every second thing, or almost everything on the list had, and the minister's working on that, and we'll come to that in due course.
Accelerate this, accelerate that.
And you sort of think, well, if you just talked about stuff that's already happening, where was the sort of great leap forward? But look, maybe my expectations are too high when I think there's going to be some great leap forward. I don't know, but it's a funny one. I take your point about the bubble. Everything must feel good in the room, high fives, cups of coffee, can I borrow your pen, all that sort of stuff. And it feels pretty good. And then the actual outcomes are a little less easy to grasp. But to your point, hope and positivity, that's not a bad thing. That's true.
Yeah, he sort of brought it all together when he started talking about the inequality and particularly the intergenerational inequality. And, it's a problem. We speak about it a fair bit here, James. It's only getting bigger. I mean, the boomers, God bless them, they worked bloody hard for decades, but they've got the loot. The young people are working hard today, feel like they don't have the loot and they're never going to get the loot. And we sort of wonder whether this sort of social contract in society is broken down. I mean, from what Chalmers said, everyone around the round table can see that.
Yeah.
It's something that binds everyone. But of course, all this stuff's only as good as the government. Politics will come into play here. Now, Chalmers, he called the tax system imperfect, which I thought was a big step for him. And tax was the last thing that he spoke about at the press conference. But it's one of the things, James, that we hear about the most. How genuine do you think the government is about tax reform?
Not overly. Not overly. I mean, we went into this with a very, very clear line in the sand from both Albanese and Chalmers that there'd be no tax changes coming out of it.
Yeah.
And now, are we to believe that after 3 days inside the magic cave, Jim's come out and decided, well, don't worry about that. There will be tax changes. The idea that he and everybody else in the room can see a philosophical problem with the fact that workers are being taxed too harshly to support older Australians who, in your words, already have the loot, there's a problem with that. But any changes are going to have to go through cabinet, and you can feel that the pushback against any changes that do look like wealth taxes or taxes on superannuation, they'll be so bitterly fought. I think Chalmers might like the idea of tax reform Whether he and the government has the stomach to actually do it is an entirely different thing. But look, the encouraging thing was they're not going to do some big whiz-bang review of the tax system that takes another 5 years. They're just going to try and get on with a few solutions and come up with some ideas. So maybe that's a bit more promising. Maybe we can whack something on the table and start kicking it round sooner rather than later. There are some hard conversations. Chalmers said throughout his speech and the subsequent press conference that a mandate only comes from the electorate. So I think any big tax changes will have to be taken to the next election. So that's 3 years away. And I think that's the time frame that you need to be thinking about for any tax reform if it actually happens. Although, one caveat there, Anthony, it does sound like one of the near-term tax reforms, minor tax reforms, is road user charging. Gosh, I've never heard so much about road user charging in my life. Please tell me what road user charging is and why is it suddenly the most necessary thing in this fine nation?
Which, James, I think this just shows that Chalmers came out of this realising that they needed some quick wins, right, to show progress, to show that they were actually doing stuff. It wasn't just a list of pie in the sky stuff that they'd come up with inside a room over 3 days. Yeah, you're right. The one he spoke a lot about was road user charging. It's something the state treasurers are working up, and he said New South Wales's Daniel Mookie had been particularly involved around the roundtable on it. Now, road user charging is changing the way that drivers pay for their road use. So at the moment, the government charges us excise on fuel, right? 51.6 cents a litre on petrol and diesel this financial year, James.
Gotcha.
Now, there's a shift to want to change that towards charging you based on the distance you drive rather than the fuel you use, which is to capture EVs, which don't use petrol, hybrids, which use a lot less petrol, and it's going to be more of those in the future. So the government subsidises them effectively, and effectively other road users are now paying for them as well. You know, they're paying their excise, the EV drivers aren't. It makes sense to think about it now, right? Because this it's an emerging trend. Now, Chalmers said there was a lot of support in the room for road user charging. He almost seemed surprised. Like, it sounded like there was barely any dissenters. He said the room didn't agree on exactly what needed to change or the model they needed to go to as such, but they're keen to progress this in the near term. So I think it's just one example. If we laid out all the things that Chalmers came away with, it sounded like this was one that was actually actionable. Hence why he was so busy in calling it out. James, housing got a good run too. As it should.
Sure.
You know, you wrote last year that housing's eating everything. Do you get the impression the government has worked out how to fix the housing shortage though, or is it still a bit TBD?
Very TBD. And again, I don't think there's any massively new things coming. The biggest concrete thing that Chalmers pointed to was there's a backlog of 10,000 homes that are waiting for environmental and planning approvals. He sort of promised that they would look into ways to dealing with that backlog as quickly as possible. That sounds like a pretty smart thing to me. But, you know, we need to be building 120,000 homes a year. So, yes, let's deal with the 100,000 issues we've got in planning. But I thought we might get some really big bang thing where, you know, there was agreement, for example, that the federal government needed to take over planning and zoning from state governments and local governments.
Yeah.
You know, we keep saying this is a housing crisis, but then we don't do any crisis-like governance around it. But I didn't detect anything like that. You know, there's a bit of stuff around skills and skills recognition, migration. Maybe there'll be some stuff around construction techniques, you know, modular housing, which has been getting a bit of a run. All that's good. Doesn't feel like the sort of war room mentality that you might have expected would come out of something like this, though. So now, Anthony, we just wait and see how the government can grasp the momentum of this. I mean, to his credit, like Chalmers did say, you know, we do have to capture the momentum. We do have to get things done. We do have to start some of these processes. I think the road user charging, not to come back to that again, I think there's a meeting of treasurers in early September where he'll have that discussion again. So I think now the challenge, to your point, that these ideas are only going to be as good as the government can be. So how good is the government now at sort of executing these things? And can the sense of camaraderie, cooperation in that room survive outside in the real world? That's the big question for me.
Yeah. The thing that struck me, James, as I listened to it, is inflation and where inflation fits in. I was thinking, are we having this conversation because we've just come through this inflation period? The cost of living's gone up so much, it's got more people under pressure. Is that why we're having it now?
Yeah.
Or we're having it now because we've sort of stamped out the worst of the inflation, and maybe we can afford to think a bit longer term, and it's not just about next quarter's, electricity bill and giving some sort of lollies to help cover that. So whatever happens in the background, I think we need to keep on top of the inflation, right? Because it's only when you get inflation out of the equation or not such a big problem that maybe you get to think about this long-term stuff.
Yeah, well said, Anthony. Well said.
Okay, James, let's get to our second topic. And the second big week of profit season was dominated by one of our truly great, truly global companies delivering a truly large stink bomb. Shares in the healthcare and pharmaceutical giant CSL will end the week down about 16%, wiping billions off its market value after the company delivered a poor profit outlook for the 2026 financial year, announced it was spinning off one of its biggest businesses, and revealed it will slash 3,000 jobs. James, this was a kitchen sink announcement from the bluest of blue chips on the ASX. Why did investors hate it so much?
Oh, Anthony, that's a great question. I think these things look like they're sort of instant reactions. That the CSL shares fell, 17%, I think it was on the day of this announcement. It felt like, all at once, everybody had decided to sell and head for the exits. But it's never quite like that, is it? These things build up over time. And while the ASX has jumped 45% in the last 3 years, CSL shares have basically gone sideways. And from a company that's long been a sort of darling of the Australian market, the pressure was building on the chief executive, Paul McKenzie, to do something about it, in inverted commas. Now, he came to results day with, a big slate of things he was going to do about it. He announced, as you said, the cutting of 3,000 jobs, which I think is sort of 10% of the workforce. It's a big cut, serious cut. He announced that they'll be closing some R&D hubs, basically trying to make their business more efficient. And then he also announced that they will spin off their vaccines business, which is called Securus, and they're going to spin that off into an entirely new company that'll be listed on the ASX, which is, we see companies do that from time to time. This is going to be one of, if not the biggest ever demerger on the ASX. So you'd think, hey, that's a bit of a reason to be excited. But the problem was that this self-help came with a really disappointing profit outlook for 2026. And investors sort of just saw red. All they saw was that the problems that had been building in this company, or they believed have been building in this company for a few years, weren't being fixed in the short term, and they're gone, or a good chunk of them are gone. And you can understand where investors' heads are at. I'm going to sell this now. It's not going to get much better for a few years. Let them do their fix up. Let them do their self-help, and maybe I'll buy back in later. But for the moment, I've just had enough, and the message isn't getting through. Anthony, you sort of track this. The dissatisfaction against CSL from investors it's been a drumbeat for the best part of a year now, and it just hasn't gone away.
Yeah, I think you explained it really well, James. I think this moment has been coming for 3 years. CSL did well in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, paid $16 billion for a Swiss business called V4, which develops drugs for iron deficiency, kidney-related therapies. It just paid too much. The acquisition was too slow to fire, took a lot of management time. There were already concerns from investors about CSL's capital allocation, its R&D spending. And then it goes out with this giant mother of a deal and highlighted perhaps just how much it had lost its way. I mean, fund managers have been talking about this for the past 2 years. Like you said, CSL had been underperforming on the ASX. It really slipped down the ranks as the other big caps like CBA and the banks were rocketing up, Wesfarmers too. But CSL never really had its lightning rod moment that turned the frustration that was boiling inside investors into an actual trigger.
Yeah.
And we got that this week. the result was quite spectacular. Analysts downgraded their earnings forecasts just for FY26 this year by 16%.
Yikes.
That's a huge downgrade.
Massive move.
For a quality company, a company that's, people normally associate with bankable, repeatable, steady earnings, not speed bumps, and
Yeah.
it was very un-CSL-like, all the stuff that was going on. And
this has been bugging me for all night, right?
Yeah.
So we've got the economic roundtable in Canberra, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's going on. It's specifically designed to try and fire up the economy, find a way to get the economy going again. As that's winding down on Thursday afternoon, the ASX 200 goes through 9,000 points for the first time. As I said, it's up 45% in the last 3 years, when earnings over those last 3 years have gone backwards on an aggregate level.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen in profit reporting season, I can't recall a single company doing a single big investment in Australia. What we've seen is cost cutting. CSL, Brambles, BHP warning they might have to take jobs out. Horizon cutting jobs. What's going on? I mean, surely cost cuts aren't the way to deliver the profit growth that 9,000 points on the ASX says that we're coming into.
Yeah, I mean, Iris, Telstra, Transurban, APA Group's got rid of a lot of jobs by transferring one of its businesses. Northern Star beat on lower costs. Patrick Port's owner Cube was lauded for its cost control. You're right, James. There's a lot of focus on costs, and you can understand why. I mean, the economy's growing at 1.7% this year. I think the RBA says 2% in the year to June next year. So companies not get a lot of help growing that top line.
Totally.
Yeah, there's not a lot of rocket ship growth by any stretch of the imagination. So how do you grow earnings? Remember, CEO's got 3 levers, don't they? Price, volume, and cost. And the economic backdrop shows you that price and volume are hard. So they're focusing on the cost, and the cost is labour and job cuts. And as you said, James, ASX got to 9,000 points on Thursday. I must admit, it caught me by surprise. It just kept ticking up and up and up and up in the past month or so. To be up 10% this year, like an amazing run. And to think, like you said, it comes after 3 years of no earnings growth across the ASX. It comes after analysts are not even expecting that much growth for FY26. I think Macquarie analysts are saying there could be 2% earnings per share growth, which doesn't scream 9,000 points at all. So it's not profits driving this 9,000, James. I think it's for the ASX to be trading at more than 20 times earnings when it's normally in the 16 sort of range. There's something else going on.
Yes, it might be super fund money. It might be foreign capital trying to hide out anywhere but China. I think this ASX at 9,000 points is a false signal, Anthony. I cannot reconcile the ASX at 9,000 with what's actually happening in the economy. I think we should be really careful at these levels, but look, maybe that's just me. Anthony, just while we're enjoying this pity party on the ASX, CSL wasn't the only company to cop an absolute hiding from investors. Tell us what happened to poor old James Hardie.
Oh, James, the investor anger at James Hardie, it's gone from red hot to white hot, almost unbelievably. Like it's self-immolation in only 5 months. The great Australian company, albeit with a checkered history because of the asbestos and asbestosis claims of the past. But, it makes Hardie Plank, which is weatherboard, lightweight housing construction, big in Australia, even bigger in North America. 3/4 of its sales of the weatherboard products are in North America. Yeah. Really, it's a US company that had an ASX listing, but it went out and bought this big US flooring group called ASX about 6 months ago. James, it was a huge deal. US $9 billion, script-based. Hardie's basically gave 26% of the company away to the other company's shareholders to do the deal. Now, the Australian investors at Hardie's hated it from the start. You're paying too much, going long US housing at the wrong time, the structure of it, just everything about it, right? And Hardie's stock tanked and created a storm. Anyway, Hardie's, to their credit, or not, maybe to their discredit, they got through the deal. And it only just completed about 6 weeks or so ago. So they're fronting shareholders for the first time this week, and their first earnings result. I mean, you called it a feces sandwich, James, which I thought was very out there for the senior chook, but I loved it. It was so far short of market expectations. Softer market conditions were anticipated, but this was a combination of soft conditions, market share losses, even capital concerns, James. Like, it was just amazing. Shareholders went ballistic straight away. Analysts were asking questions. I mean, they cut their earnings per share forecast by 46% for FY26, which is not something you normally see. So what started as a questionable acquisition, very questionable one, and hugely contentious. I mean, now these hardy shareholders have just lost their minds, and there's more questions about the acquisition, more questions about going longer US housing market, more questions about management's credibility. Shares are down 30% this week, James. That's $10 billion of market cap just gone. And it's sort of not unlike CSL. You know, this is a market darling, a rare global grower on the ASX, an Australian champion. Investors were there for growth. Now the growth is spluttering, and of course it goes out and buys something big. It may be the wrong time, and now it's just caught in this quagmire of its own making.
Yeah. Well, the good news is, Anthony, we've got a week of profit season to go, so I reckon it could be pretty rocky. We'll have to see what happens. All right, Anthony, we'll come back after the break and take you to one of the world's great places on the financial calendar, Jackson Hole. Back in a sec. Well, welcome back. If you want to know more about what we're talking about today and a whole lot more, AFR subscribers can sign up to the Chanticleer newsletter at join.afr.com/Chanticleer. Every Saturday morning, the newsletter pulls together the best Chanticleer columns from the week and delivers them straight to your inbox. Okay, Anthony, I mentioned the wonderfully named Jackson Hole, where tonight Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, that's the US equivalent of Michelle Bullock and the RBA, he will give his annual speech at the Fed's annual symposium, which is held in Wyoming at this wonderful place called Jackson Hole. Anthony's going to tell us the market hopes he's going to tell us whether we're going to get a US rate cut in September or not. But also, we're wondering if poor old Jerome Powell might bite back against Donald Trump, who's been slandering him for months now, basically demanding that he cut rates. Is this going to be the heavyweight speech of the century?
Oh, yeah, there's going to be heaps of interest in it, James. And I don't know if you saw Walmart, what they came out and said overnight, costs up everywhere. They said the inflation's out there. So, yeah, mate, this one could be juicy.
Absolutely. On Tuesday, we get a bit of central bank news of our own. We get the RBA's minutes. Of course, they cut rates last week, but we're going to find out, Anthony, how much did the RBA board talk about the issue of productivity, which Governor Michelle Bullock was a little unwilling to talk about at her post-decision press conference last week?
Surely got to mention.
Surely it did, yes, particularly ahead of the economic roundtable. And then, as we mentioned, Anthony, it's the sort of final week of reporting season. Big names. Santos and Fortescue on Monday, Coles on Tuesday, Woolies on Wednesday, Wesfarmers and Qantas on Thursday, and Virgin Australia flying in for its first official result as a public company on the final day on Friday. It's going to be some big names there. We'll get a good sense of how the economy's tracking.
Yeah, third and final week. It'll be lovely when it's done, James.
Fair enough. Well, we love questions here on the Chanticleer podcast. This week, our question's from Simon in Canberra. If you've got a question you want to send in, you can email us at chanticleer@afr.com. You can send us a question audio form. Just record a voice memo on your phone and include your name and where you're from and email it to us. And there's also a widget on all the Chanticleer articles at afr.com where you can submit questions. Thanks to everyone who's been sending some good questions and provocations and challenges and ideas through. We really appreciate it. So Simon asks, big fan of the podcast. James, thanks for your piece last week calling out the AI will create jobs line as crap. As you've noted, AI is already reshaping the white-collar workforce in Australia. How could we realistically fund a universal basic income? I'm pessimistic. We've squandered the resources boom and its potential to generate true sovereign wealth, and both major parties show no serious signs of addressing the housing crisis, and the tax system is skewed against young PAYG slaves like Anthony and myself. Will Albo morph from consensus seeker to courageous leader in time to meet the challenges and opportunities AI brings to Australians? Simon, this is a great question, and I had a lot of feedback on this article, Anthony, which sort of suggested that the middle class is already feeling the world's pretty unequal and AI is only making them more scared. The idea of a universal basic income, which I guess is basically a government-provided income for everybody who needs it, do you think it's realistic, Anthony? I mean, it would be a big shift, wouldn't it? But maybe it would be a necessary one at some stage.
Huge shift, absolutely massive shift. At a time when government balance sheets are already sort of feeling it. There was a lot of talk about AI on Chalmers' priority list, weren't there, James?
Totally, yeah. But it was mainly around copyright and those sort of things, not...
Yeah, legislative framework.
Yeah. Not the universal basic income. I mean, just you think about tax reform, Anthony, funding something like a universal basic income would be our first challenge, wouldn't it?
100%. I mean, like it would be a huge shift.
One of the ways it's been suggested to fund it is to tax AI profits. So companies that profiting from the use of AI would have to basically help to pay for a UBI, which is an interesting idea. I'm not entirely sure how it would work. But I think, Simon, this is going to be one that we're sort of forced into. I can't see Australian governments preparing for it, trying to get ahead of it. I think it's one that we don't really know if we're going to need it at this stage, and we'll need to see where the AI revolution comes. But I just hope there's a bit of preparedness to at least discuss ideas like this in the coming years, because sort of once it's here and once you need it, it's going to be too late. You need to be ready for it. So I think in 2 or 3 years, maybe there'll be another roundtable, Anthony, and maybe a chatbot will be invited to give its views around the table. Who knows? One to watch. All right, Anthony, it's been another big week. Our stocks are not as low as CSL and James Hardie. We're still highly valued here, and your work's particularly highly valued. So looking forward to diving into the last week of profit season with you next week.
Thank you, James. Have a good weekend.
Terrific. We'll see you later. If you like the podcast and you want to hear more, consider sharing or giving the podcast a review, as it helps other listeners find us. And don't forget to follow wherever you get your podcasts. At the Financial Review, we investigate the big stories about markets, business and power. For more, go to afr.com and you can subscribe to the Financial Review, the daily habit of successful people, at afr.com/subscribe. Chanticleer was hosted by me, James Thompson and Anthony McDonald. It was produced by Alex Gow with assistance from Fiona Rennie. Our theme is by Alex Gow. Head of Premium Content is Fiona Buffini.
The Australian Financial Review.